So I just send regards to all the audience today and point out the point that the climate change has become an urgent issue, and of course, agriculture is doing and is contributing to the response to the climate change. And okay, so today we will talk to Professor Sayed about the transformation of agriculture in the face of global climate crisis. And so let's start the conversation with Professor Sayed. I would like to introduce a little bit about Professor Sayed. Okay, and now I would like to invite Professor Sayed to share your greetings with all the viewers that join us in tonight's talk show. So please, Professor.
Thank you. Let me first of all say I'm so honored to be here and talking to you this evening, and for your interest in this book. But I'm so pleased to be speaking to you because until recently I was based in Southeast Asia. I spent 14 years in Southeast Asia, visited most countries in the region, and established this center, Crops for the Future, which we will discuss, I'm sure, during the session now. We established it deliberately in Southeast Asia, in fact, in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, in 2010. And it then became the only center in the world for the crops of the future, the crops that we now need to consider as the opportunity crops for humanity and the issues that you've mentioned about climate change. So I'm deeply honored to be asked to join you, and I'm particularly honored that the Vietnamese edition will be the first language that will be translated other than English for this book.
Really?
So I'm delighted with that, yes.
Okay, that's very interesting to know, Professor. Okay, so I would like to ask, in order to have an overview of today's topic, so I not ask, but we will show a video that Quảng Văn publisher already prepared about your book, The Ninth Revolution. Interesting video. Sorry that it's no English subtitle, but it's mainly talking about the main idea in your book. The first question I would like to ask Professor Sayed is, I think all of the readers want to ask you why you read or you write and publish The Ninth Revolution. Okay, please, Professor.
Well, of course, we remember it almost seems a different world, but when COVID and the pandemic happened, the world changed for everybody. But for me, it was the first time in many, many years that I stopped traveling. I stopped having to give lectures, and I stopped being required to answer emails and phone calls, and everything was suddenly stopped. And I was sitting at home and I thought, we don't know how long COVID is going to last. We don't know when we will be free to come outside again. Let me take this opportunity to reflect, to sit back and think about my career and what contribution I might have made to the food system and the research on food systems. So that inspired me to sit down and write this book as not as a memoir, but as a record that I thought would help people understand why we now have the food system that we already have, and why I feel it's not going to be adequate, as COVID expressed to all of us, the risks of continuing with business as usual. So it inspired me to say, well, you can always say we can't carry on like this, but what should we do? What should the future be if we don't use the existing agri-food system? So that's what inspired me to write it. And I then had the time to spend all day alone in my study in Malaysia writing this book without any distractions and without any other jobs to do other than make sure that I myself could get some food to eat.
Thank you, Professor. And so the second question is, what part of the writing the Nine Revolution that you enjoy the most?
Thank you. Yeah. Of course, I wrote the book about my own research and the work that we've been doing on alternative and underutilized crops, crop diversity. But I didn't want to just write that. Without writing how we got here, it didn't make much sense for people to say, so why do we need diverse crops? But what I enjoyed particularly was the part where we actually set up the first center in the world for alternative crops. And for me, that was quite a journey. It was a fantastic opportunity, which we very rarely get, not just to do what we love, but to get the resources and support to set up a center to do the work that we believe should be done. And we set up Crops for the Future in 2010. And the part of the book that I enjoyed most was writing about that story, because we were so much involved in it. As I mentioned, COVID came along, but before that, we were fully immersed in setting up a center, recruiting staff, building facilities, getting investors, making international partners. All of that occupied all of our time. And it was so wonderful then to sit down and write about it, because it was really something very dramatic, I think, to set up a new center and to attract so many very bright people from your region, from Southeast Asia. Most of our staff were young people, young scientists, young postdocs, academics, practitioners, technicians, administrators, who all joined this new organization without any history, without any background. We simply had to start from the beginning. And to write that and put it down was really quite a wonderful experience for me, because we achieved something in 10, 12 years, which big international centers have always found very difficult to establish a role that you feel you actually have a contribution to make to the world's food system. So that was the part I enjoyed most.
Okay. So it means that during the time that you write the book, the idea of construction of the Center for Alternative Crop is come up?
Yes. No.
It's from the Center for the Crop for the Future, right? Okay.
Crops for the Future was already established as a very small center, initially in the UK and then later on in Sri Lanka. But there was an international call to find a new home for it. And we had an opportunity to bid for this center, which was to be called Crops for the Future. So when it was called Crops for the Future, we had to persuade at that time the University of Nottingham, my university, and the government of Malaysia to become partners to allow us to host this center in Malaysia, where I was already the vice provost of the University of Nottingham campus. So that's why we built it in Malaysia, but also because Malaysia is at the center of a huge biodiversity treasure trove. You know how much biodiversity, not just on the land, but in the oceans around Southeast Asia. Apart from Amazon, Southeast Asia is the richest source of land biodiversity. It is the richest source of marine biodiversity. So what a good place to put a centre in the heart of the biodiverse capital of the world, Southeast Asia. So that's why it was based there, and that's how we were able to get a centre established for alternative crops in the centre of agrobiodiversity.
I can see that many people would like to ask you directly. It's just the beginning and it's already hot in here.
That's very good.
So yeah. So maybe Hang No, I don't know. Please just feel free to address the question.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Actually, I missed your the short video on your book, and I have two questions.
Sure.
What makes the crop underutilized, and why you focus on this crop, and what do you think this crop will play a role in the future? Thank you.
Well, that's a really good question, and it will come up, I'm sure, as we continue the talk. But first of all, as I describe in the book, you know, we haven't been farming for very long. If we think of how long human beings have farmed, it's only about 12,000 years, but we have existed as a species for about 3 million years. So most of that time, we have been hunter-gatherers. We've been collecting plants, we've been hunting animals. Only 12,000 years ago, we started farming. But in those 12,000 years, we've reduced the biodiversity and choice of crops dramatically. From about 30,000 edible plants, we're now down to just 4 crops, which feed more than half the planet. And that struck us as astonishing and very risky, because if you only have 4 big crops, wheat, rice, maize, soy, feeding 8 billion people, how will they survive? How will we be able to feed 10 billion people by 2050 with so few crops? So we said there are 7,000 crops around the world that are grown, but they're underutilized. They're not mainstream crops. They're not grown for export. They're not transported around the world. They don't even feed their own populations. Many crops have to be brought in to feed people. So those are the underutilized crops. And they were given very negative names. Underutilized by itself is a negative name. Forgotten, neglected, orphan. You know, these are terms that don't attract you to a crop. When you say it's an orphan crop, why would I want to grow it? So the terms became very associated with the past, with negative, with lost. And the term crops for the future was developed to say, no, they're not just the past. These could be the crops of the future. These underutilized crops could actually be the opportunity crops that we need in a future which will be far more unreliable than it is now, far more unpredictable. The environment is going to be unpredictable. As we know, the political systems are going to be unpredictable. How can we depend on just 4 crops? So that's how we evolved the idea of underutilized crops actually having some value. But in terms of statistics, they don't appear even on national records as being produced, because they're done and grown in the informal market. They're not traded, they're not exported. So there's very, very little data on these crops, yet people have been growing them for thousands of years, and they have been ignored, especially people in marginal regions, people like women who've grown these crops. We've simply ignored that information and said, they're not major crops, we're not interested in them. So that was really the justification to start looking at them scientifically. But in the context of climate change, it's impossible not to look at alternatives to our current crops. And these are the ones that we now have identified as the opportunity crops that will add to the major crops we already have and we know lots about.
So the next question is, in your opinion, so what values that the Ninth Revolution book that can bring to the Southeast Asian culture, agriculture in general, and for the Vietnamese agriculture in particularly? Sorry, I will translate into Vietnamese for the question. And the next question I would like to ask, follow up to the previous one, is who do you think would benefit the most from this book? Yeah. Okay. So and why, please?
Why is it relevant for Southeast Asia and Vietnam particularly? Is because you are at the interface of three major forces that are occurring in the world. First of all, climate change. Vietnam is enormously vulnerable. I think it is the fifth most vulnerable country to climate change. And your vulnerability is not in just one area. If you go to parts of the world, drought is the main issue. But you have drought and heat stress. You have a very long coastline, and that coastline is very vulnerable, of course, to sea level rise and to saltwater intrusion. So essentially, you are in a very vulnerable place climatically. That's the first issue. And that's not going to stop. That's going to get more extreme, and the conditions will get much more difficult for everybody, but also especially farming. The second is you have a huge natural resource, not just its people. You have 105 million people, which is a huge resource, but your biodiversity is already very great. That means you already have resources to look at how you can address the future of this climate change, because you can look at crops and say, how would they fit in these future climates? How will they be resilient to these changing environments? So those are your two factors, which I think are already clear. But more recently, we have seen that if you like, the center of political gravity is moving towards Asia. You know, the empires where we have expected, the USA, if you like, or the West in general, are declining. And the powers in Southeast Asia are growing and expanding and becoming much more considerable in terms of economics and politics and food. So here is an opportunity. You have the crops. You have to make changes because the environment won't allow you to carry on growing the same crops forever. And you have the political opportunity now to become a very big player in an alternative vision of agriculture that's based on natural resources and biodiversity rather than on these very narrow supply chains that we depend on for the main staple crops at the moment. So here's a great opportunity that I think Vietnam has, and is part of the ASEAN region, where the whole region is an potential economic powerhouse for the world.
So now we will move on to the second part of today's section, is the transformation of agriculture in the face of the global climate crisis. So in the first 5 chapters of the 9 Revolution, Professor already take readers through 8 agricultural revolution, and each set it on historical context. So looking at this past revolution, how has agriculture transformed over time? Yeah, and why do we need to pursue the 9th one? Okay, so please, Professor.
Thank you, Trina. Before I answer, there's quite a long answer because you've asked a big question. Shall I answer it all in one go in English, or do you want me to break this up and allow you to do some translation?
Yeah, okay, may you break it into some part, yeah. Okay.
Okay, so let me start by saying, when I researched for the book, I realized empires and revolutions always result in a change in food system. So when we actually started history and we said, okay, we knew, I think everybody knows when the crops started growing in the Fertile Crescent, the first empire was the Akkadian Empire, the Sumerian and the Assyrian empires, which actually control water. And because they could control water, they could actually manage their empire in the regions where water was sufficient or provided to grow crops. And when water finished, the empire died. So the empire was entirely dependent on water, and it never expanded beyond where water could be used for agriculture. But the Romans, who became a very big empire, as you know, in extent, in size, and in duration, they had engineering and military skills to expand. And of course, they used slaves as well as labor to start growing crops outside just the areas where there was irrigation. They could bring water, or they could change the environment to grow crops in bigger areas of the world. And food changed because they could now take food to different places. Instead of just where it was water, they could bring new crops to regions where water was there, but those crops had not been brought there before. So they began moving crops to different parts of the world. Let me just stop there so that you can illustrate this first.
Okay, please continue.
Okay, so that was the Assyria, the Akkadians and the Romans, but then when the Muslims came and they expanded their empire, of course it was very extensive. It went from China right through to Northern Europe, but what they then did was they started innovations in agriculture, technologies, philosophy, physiology, medicine, science. All these disciplines were linked to agriculture. So now Muslims were actually using plants as medicine. And they had one other very strong skill. They brought plants to different regions of their empire, and they could grow those plants in different parts of the empire, but they could also communicate across the empire technologies. So the idea that they could actually share innovations instead of each place having its own way of doing things, there were innovations that could be transferred from one place to another. For example, irrigation. So the Muslims actually moved agriculture into another level. It was scientific, it was innovation and communication between parts of the empire to actually move lots of regions forward at the same time. And agriculture had a very particular part in that Muslim empire that changed the food systems of the world from very local to becoming much more widely utilized. Now, the big breakthrough, not because I'm sitting here in the UK, but the big breakthrough in agriculture was the result, for good and bad reasons, of the British Empire, because, of course, Britain was the cradle of capitalism. And when capitalism started, one of the first things it did was divide people into those who could grow crops, farmers, those who owned land, and those who worked on the land, who were not farmers, and they were actually laborers. And they were those people separated from those who no longer worked in farms at all. They went to work in industry, and they made products because of the Industrial Revolution. So what happened there was that agriculture then became a specialized industry. Instead of everybody grew crops and they had to feed themselves, capitalism said, you can actually make money out of agriculture. You can actually use it for trade. And when trade comes along, of course, you need exchange. You need to move things from one place to another. You need to sell it, which means you have to have capital. And you begin to think about crops and plants as commodities. We're now going to make them into something from which we can extract profit. So the empire of the British, of course, at one time was a quarter of the world. And for Britain, this was fantastic because they could extract resources somewhere else and bring them to Britain. Plants which they couldn't grow in Europe or certainly in Britain as stimulants, coffee, tea, sugar, cocoa, tobacco, opium, were all traded for money and grown somewhere else for the benefit of the British Empire, which then could make money from the capital invested, and the value addition was made in Britain, not in the country where those crops were grown. They grew rice and wheat and, of course, other crops which they could then transport to the UK, and they invented industries like the cotton and the rubber and the palm oil industries using plantations. And in plantations, they could bring labor from other parts of the world to another part of the world where they could grow crops which didn't come from there. If you think of the Caribbean, sugar doesn't come from the Caribbean, and the slaves were not from the Caribbean. They were brought from Africa to make sugar for the British consumer. So this was how the British Empire transformed the food systems of the world by moving crops and people and extracting the resources for profit. And that really was the engine of the Industrial Revolution, and that for a long time became the economic powerhouse that Britain had, was through this external trade, preferentially to benefit the United Kingdom or for Great Britain.
Okay, I make it short.
Sure, no, that's fine. Now, what happened then was, from this vast diversity, by having an empire, the British could actually superimpose their own choice on the crops that people already had in their own country and devalue the local crops. They could say these are the reasons I've told you about underutilized. They could stigmatize, you know the word stigma, they could make these crops undesirable, unrespected, backward, poor people, and impose these crops which they felt were their commodity crops onto the local population. So what we saw was commoditization of agriculture into very few crops that were preferred by the colonial power and marginalize all the other local crops. I remember working in Africa where even local crops that were grown, farmers were punished for growing them because they competed with the export crop that Britain wanted or the Europeans wanted for their own economies. So that was one of the examples that I give in the book of a crop called Bambara groundnut, an African crop that had to be almost grown in secret because Britain wanted peanut for export, the peanut oil for its own economy. So that meant fewer and fewer crops became commodities. And of course, as you know, as a scientist, we do research on where we can actually get resources, where we can get financial support, where we can get investment, and only investment went on those crops. All the other crops were neglected because we were told they were no good. So there was no investment, no research, no support for those other crops. So that's how we got to this consolidation. What became the Green Revolution was a consolidation around very few crops. And I mentioned at the beginning, just 4 Green Revolution crops now dominate the world's food system. And that's why in the book, I wanted to write about why those 4 crops became so dominant.
So are you mentioning about the 5th one also? Or just continue the 4th one?
No, I think all of these are, I say 4 because it illustrates the principle. 60% of the world's comes from four crops, okay. But actually there's about 12 major crops. There's about 90 crops that feed all of us. So, you know, we're not saying just 4 crops. I just meant in this pyramid, the 4 crops at the top attracted so much support and investment, and everything else became less and less as they fell down the position on the pyramid. But okay. Research, investment, marketing, support, all went to the crops near the top of that pyramid. And so we come to the Green Revolution. And of course, people looked at the Green Revolution as a huge success. And in many ways it was, because it produced food which could then feed people who had previously been suffering from famine and from shortage of calories. But if we look at it in context, it again produced this very small range of crops grown in one system, monoculture. So when we look at the Green Revolution, you need certain inputs, fertilizer, irrigation, machinery, high-yielding varieties selected to grow in the best conditions of these few crops. So, of course, we will see success stories because the investment and the support and the infrastructure and the subsidies all went to these few crops. And we can't definitely say all the other crops were the same. If we'd spent that much money, they would also be big crops. That's not really the point. The point is it became very much focused on the 4 crops, and everything else was ignored, or everything else was marginalized. Now, when the Green Revolution succeeded, it produced very high calorie-rich crops. And when we see now a world, and I notice in your country, Vietnam is now the lowest obesity country in the world. Your obesity level is 2%. But in other countries, the obesity level is over 40%. And part of that is the diet that we now have become addicted to, of ultra-processed, high-calorie, sugar-rich, oil-rich crops that are made into foods. And of course, we now end up with diets which are also very narrow. When we say 4 crops, we also mean very few ingredients going in to the diets of people. And we see 2 phenomena, which I am very impressed that Vietnam has avoided. One is obesity. As we get into more sedentary lifestyles and eat more and more of these processed foods, people become more and more obese. And that's because of the diet. And we see a phenomenon called hidden hunger. And I don't know enough in Vietnam whether you have hidden hunger, but hidden hunger suggests that people who are apparently well-fed are short of micronutrients. They're deficient in zinc or iron or selenium, or ingredients that we could get from a diet that's much broader than the big 4 staple crops. So hidden hunger now is a very significant problem in much of the world, where people appear to be well fed, but they're actually very deficient in micronutrients. And again, a narrow diet restricts these micronutrients in the diet and in the choice. And so it's really important that we link dietary diversity with crop diversity, so that we can actually increase the range of ingredients that people consume, rather than depending on just these calorie-rich crops. And the Green Revolution will now be measured not just as successful calorie provision, but a cause also of micronutrient deficiency in part of the world where young people now are growing up on very restricted diets.
Okay, Professor.
Okay, so that's really why I say we have to change from the current model, because monoculture, limited number of crops growing in the best conditions is not going to be enough for us in the future. We have to rethink how we use land, and much of that land we have destroyed because of the management practices that we have imposed on these very high fertile crops, or high nutrition demanding crops that we actually have to provide so much input to. So really that takes us to where we are now. We've come to the end of the Green Revolution. It cannot carry on. You know, all revolutions come to an end at some point. The Green Revolution was the future at one time, but now we cannot continue to depend on just these few crops and try and increase their yields, even by technologies and inputs, will not increase their yields fast enough to beat climate change and meet the population growth that we're going to have to feed by the next century. So it simply is unrealistic to expect these very important crops to be enough for the future. And that's really the point that we are in humanity is, do we carry on doing the same thing, or do we look for alternatives without destroying everything we've done already? How do we pick those crops that will actually expand the diet and the landscapes? Because I think one of the questions that's come up is really we should focus on the best land and get the highest yields. Well, perhaps, but what do we do with all the other land then? What do we do with the saline land? What do we do with the sloping land? What do we do with the land that's going to be submerged in, variable amounts of water? And how are we going to manage all these areas which are not the best soils and the best climates? And those are the areas that we have to look at alternatives, because the big crops will not grow successfully in those environments. So when we start looking at these other lands, you know, not monoculture, we have to look at other cropping systems. And that's why it becomes very interesting. How can we manage landscapes, not land, not soil, not fields, but landscapes? And for that, we can start looking at multiple cropping systems, agroforestry, intercropping, relay, all these technologies which we now have displaced with monoculture, we can look at again. And for that, we need local knowledge. We need knowledge by farmers of their own climates, their own soils, their own conditions, and their own management practices, which are different from monoculture. And this is where we can start using new technologies. So when we say the future, we say, okay, these are old ways of growing crops, intercropping, agroforestry. But what about robotics, digital agriculture, systems we can use, drones we can use to monitor these environments, ways that we can find ways to actually mechanize them without having to use big machines. This is where the innovation will come, is in landscapes, which we don't have to just grow big staple crops, but we can grow multiple crops and manage them through much more clever technologies than we've been able to use in the past.
Okay, Professor.
One last, I think we can finish this question, but one landscape we have until recently ignored is the urban landscape, the cities, the towns, the built-up areas. And when I was young, less than half the world lived in cities. Now 70% of the world lives in cities. Hanoi is 5 million people, and you think, can we now use the people who live in cities and their landscapes as sources of agriculture? Of course, we can think of that, but what are the technologies? There's very little research. There's very little teaching, no university courses that show us how to do the technology and the statistics and the management of urban landscapes, but a huge opportunity for us to be able to grow crops, not the rice on the rooftop, because that's not realistic, but high value crops, vegetables, fruits, salad crops. How can we grow them efficiently near where people actually live, then transport them long distances to get to markets which are far from where the crops are grown? And this is really, I think, a huge opportunity to green the landscape of the urban environment with vegetation that is edible and is actually doing other things like cooling the environment, making better amenities for people, a happier place for people to live because it's green, but it's also productive. So there's an opportunity to diversify, because it won't be the big crops, it will be these alternative crops that give us the opportunity to diversify urban landscapes.
Do you understand Vietnamese? Because I'm just mentioned about the urban agriculture for the for the audience. I just think about that and I just say, but now you mentioned, okay, I will translate. So I would like to share you that recently in Vietnam, the trend of how can I say, rusticating.
Yes.
And they're starting the agriculture ventures again among the young people. So what is your perspective on this trend, and what should young people focus when they face the choice between producing for volume and developing a climate resilient adaptive economy? And like they should like prioritize the climate adaptation significant or the income? Yeah.
So I think this is a really important question, because we face a crisis of farming in that farmers are getting older and they're not being replaced. And if we look at the average age in Europe, average age of a farmer is 55. In Japan, it's 67. So what will we do? Because it's not like a factory which we make toys. Food is something we will need forever. And if no one is growing these crops anymore, how will we actually feed the world? So we must attract the next generation into farming, but we must make farming attractive to them. Why should they come and work long hours in the field, long way from where everyone else is, without proper pay, without proper facilities? So we must change the image of agriculture, and we must encourage not just young people, but women to come into agriculture as a business, as an opportunity that will actually help them become economically independent. So we have to think of agriculture now as the future. That's what we call crops for the future, because we have to be able to say it's not just the crops, the people are the crop of the future. If we can bring them into agriculture, they can actually become part of a productive economy, because the population of farming is going down and the cost and the need for farming is going up because there are more people we have to feed. So we can't solve that problem without more farmers or without more production. And at this point, these are the opportunities we must find for young people to come into agriculture for the first time, maybe with no background, no land, no investment. How can we get them to become the future agriculturalists? And that's really our big challenge, is to make this an attractive profession for young people. And for that, we must bring technologies to them. And most important, we must bring supporting evidence. If you're new and you've never done farming, but you want to go into it, do you need to do a 4-year degree in a university? Perhaps not. Perhaps you need some help and mentoring in all these different methods that we're going to give you to actually grow different crops in different environments and provide evidence. I'll come to evidence later, but I think this is really what we've got to do, is change the mindset of young people to see agriculture as a future for them and their country.
I would like to ask you, who are we? Who are we?
Like me.
Okay.
And scientists who now see our role as something which we think, well, we just got to help those who are already in farming. No. Scientists must attract more people into agriculture with new technologies and new ways of thinking about farming that aren't just growing the same old crops.
And Professor, we have some other question in the question that, like, the young people, what they should choose between the climate adaptation or like environmental friendly or something with the income, like how they balance that.
Yeah. Well, they have to do both. We can't ask farmers to make no money and then do something for the environment. And we can't ask farmers to grow crops that are bad for the environment. We have to combine climate resilient for the reasons I've discussed, that the climate is changing. These crops have to be resilient, but also there must be an economic benefit. Why should farmers grow crops just to keep the environment safe? They have to be able to see a profit. And that's, I think, where the innovation for young people comes in. And I give you a couple of examples that would be, I think, of interest. GAC, you have a crop called GAC.
GAC? What was that?
GAC.
Vietnamese GAC. Okay.
Yeah. You make red rice.
What is it in English?
It's the same. It's GAC fruit. In English,
really?
It's GAC fruit.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, I give you that example because we came across this plant when we were working in rainforest in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, and we saw farmers were growing GAC, but we thought, this is interesting. What is this plant? And we started looking at it, and we recognized it from the GAC fruit that is grown in Vietnam. Now, it's simply an example, but it shows the value addition, that if you grow a plant that is climate resilient, it grows long stems, it grows on a vine, but you can see the value of it if you can extract the red color, and of course you use it for Tet celebrations with
We use it for sticky rice.
Exactly. But you use it for sticky rice. But when you analyze the nutritional value, it has lycopene value 70 times higher than tomato.
Oh.
It has beta carotenoids, which is the color. It has antioxidants. It is valuable as a medicine, as a supplement. Now, if you're a young farmer and you say, I can grow this crop, but I can process it into a medicine, I can make it into a additional ingredient in foods, which gives me a value because it's a condiment, it's not just an ingredient, then you can see the value of this plant becoming much greater if you can process and add these characteristics to it. Now, we've developed a database for over 2,000 crops to show what their nutritional value is, what their potential, where you could grow them, what would be their yields, what's the economic potential. So and we call this database crop base, like database, but crop base.
Yeah.
And that database gives farmers or young people or anybody, the public, a value on the plants that they're being asked to grow and whether they're worth growing, if they're climate resilient, if they're nutritious, if they grow every year, if they produce something, but the yield won't be very high. If you invest in it, how many years before you get some money back? This is the sort of information young people need to go into farming. And this is the information we provide free so that anybody who wants to use this information. But what we really want are partners to collect the evidence, because we're a small center. We can't go and measure these ingredients everywhere. But if we had a partner in Vietnam that said, let's measure all the nutritional contents of our local crops and try and see which ones would give us the better return, better income, better yields, better investment potential, and maybe partner up with a research institute or a government agency saying, let's look at these crops for Vietnam and see what their economic potential is, but particularly, can we make them into something which value addition to the raw materials?
Okay, I personally will keep contact with you about this because I'm working in the university and also we focus on the future crops. Okay, so the next question. When reading the Ninth Revolution, you also mentioned several key terms related to the future of agriculture, such as crops for the future, like we already mentioned, transforming energy, transforming food system, and biodiversity, and etc. So, in your view, what will be the key agricultural trends in the next year, 2026? And how can we effectively respond to this trend? Maybe not only in 2026, maybe until 2030 or something. So can you see the trends?
I answer that in two parts. The first part relates to this question you asked just before about climate resilience and how can we produce crops that are climate resilient but also economic, and then how can we make these into something for young people. So let me try and answer that part, and then what are the trends for the future. So another example I give in the book is about aquaculture. Now, very important part of Vietnam's economy is aquaculture and fisheries. The problem for aquaculture is that we are catching so many fish from the ocean and making into fish meal. And if we take the South China Sea in 1960, that was how much fish stocks. They're now down to 10% or 5% of the fish stocks that were in the South China Sea in 1960. So our fish stocks are declining very dramatically, and we are extracting fish largely to make into fish meal, to put into aquafeed, to feed fish in aquatic systems. And what we've done is we developed alternatives to fish meal using insects. And you say, well, is that the job of Crops for the Future? You know, you're not an insect research center, but we developed feed for the insects from alternative crops. So when you take Sesbania, Moringa, I mentioned, try and grow perennial crops because they survive in climate variation much better than annual crops. And in Vietnam, you grow Moringa, which is grown almost all over the country on the roadside as a wild plant, Sesbania, even some of the other crops which are now processed into fruit, you get the byproducts. What we can do is produce a substrate to feed black soldier fly insects. And farmers could then be trained to grow crops not to feed people directly, but to feed insects. And if we can control the protein level in those feeds, Sesbania, Moringa, these plants that we know what their protein level is in the leaf, make it into a substrate for black soldier fly and produce very high protein-rich insect meal, we can replace the fish meal in aquaculture. And we have tested this, and we can replace about 70% of the fish meal with insect meal, which the fish will not reject because they still feel they're getting the proper diet. So here's a real innovation for young people, is to grow insect farms with these crops on soil which no one wants to grow big crops on, and then create this value addition of insect meal and reduce the national demand on fish meal for aquaculture feed. And that's a circular innovation which we think is the sort of idea that young people can see developing into economic potential for them as farmers who don't grow big crops, but they grow crops as part of this fish meal replacement program, if you like.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay.
Now, just to think of the future, if you think of the South China Sea, temperature prediction is going to be 2 degrees warmer by 2050. And 2 degrees warmer, the fish will move north and south to the colder regions. So fish is going to be a big issue in the South China Sea, including the political and territorial issues. There's going to be a supply issue. So aquaculture is going to become even more important, and having a reliable source of aquaculture feed from land-based agriculture will really be an important innovation.
There's an audience, they would like to talk to you directly before you mentioned about the second one.
Sure.
Hằng Ngô có chia sẻ không ha?
I have several questions. Professor, is that better and more sustainable to focus on a few and high productive crops in proper and suitable land area than working on less productive crops, such as underutilized one, and that make us use more land, and especially even the land that is very sensitive to ecological problem, such as sloping land? Thank you.
Sure. No, I know that question well. The answer is we should not ignore the big crops on good land. That isn't our point. But they're not making good land anymore. The land is getting less and less for the high-yielding crops because climate change and the soil, the conditions in soils are getting so bad that the big crops won't be able to grow in those environments. So we're not saying let's clear more rainforest or replace natural vegetation. We're saying there's more and more land now that is unsuitable for the big crops. And that land, we should not try and make the big crops grow in that land which is unsuited to them, because it will become more expensive and riskier for farmers to try and grow big crops on land that's becoming less and less suitable, more and more marginal. This is where our crops can fit, these marginal lands that no longer are sufficient to support the big crops. But we can restore them, for instance, with leguminous underutilized crops that can fix nitrogen and improve the soil conditions. by better management, better intercropping systems. So the answer is we need to look after the big crops on the best land, but where they can no longer grow on marginal soils, we need to look at other crops as our priority.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, it sounds quite, valid and good idea. Thank you.
Okay, so please continue with your second idea.
Okay, so looking forward to the future, this is what we have to now plan for. And I think your question was really what would be the key agricultural trends for the next few years? I think the first agricultural trend will be we have to think of food security as national security. Now, I'll give you an example. Singapore, which has almost no agricultural land, it's a tiny country, has a strategy called 30 by 30. In other words, by 2030, it will be 30% food secure. Imagine, 30% of Singapore will be fed from its own crops. How and why? When Singapore imports from 140 countries around the world, it now realizes if the supply chain breaks, it depends on those crops from someone else who may choose not to sell them. There may be a political reason, there may be a financial reason, whatever reason, they can't get their food. The consequences are national security. And Vietnam should think about food security now, not simply as something we would need to have, but we have been given so many recent warnings about what happens when we depend on other people to grow our crops for us. COVID disrupted all the supply chains around the world. We had to rely on our own local supply chains. The Ukraine war disrupted almost all the wheat and barley and maize production, where countries in Africa, especially North Africa, depended almost entirely on Ukrainian cereals to feed them. And therefore, when the war happened, they were totally lost. And of course, we saw upheavals in that region. And we know there will be more crises in the years ahead because the world is an unstable place. So Vietnam should now look at, I wouldn't call it food security, I would call it nutrition security. Can it provide enough nutritious food from its own country, from its own resources, to ensure it can feed its own 100 million more people? And how can we build that food security and nutritional security using local resources? For instance, crops, of course, but also value addition, processing technologies, ways to actually make food that people will see that they can actually grow and eat local food, not imported food, not junk food, not processed food. All of that should be part of the strategy to two things. One, because the risks of depending on someone else are huge and they will get bigger because the world is an unstable place, and because economically you then depend on other countries to feed you, and you are then very vulnerable to the international markets. So I think, and I'm sure this is something the government will have thought about, but building a food secure supply chain within the country, and at least within the region, should now be a national priority to make sure that your country is actually well nourished and eating a proper diet, even if there is conflict in any other parts of the world.
Okay, very interesting idea, Professor. So, okay, so next, I think now we move to the part that all of the audience that will be very exciting that you can make the question. Actually, during the talk, they already make some questions, but now it's open for all of you to ask about the book, The Ninth Revolution, or anything about Professor Sayed. Please. In the meantime, I will read the question that some of the audience is already sent to us.
Sure.
So the first question is from the CEO of Quảng Văn, the CEO of Quảng Văn publisher, Mr. Trịnh Minh Tuấn. So he asked, okay, I will speak in Vietnamese first. So his question is, you know that Vietnam is an agricultural country, so he would like to ask your idea on the policies for the Vietnamese government that can create a sustainable agriculture.
Thank you.
Nice.
I think what the government already does is support agriculture, but it doesn't. I don't say Vietnamese government, but governments in general don't build support along the whole. The whole chain. So when they say, "Oh, we're going to invest in genetics or biotechnology," they do that, but there's no market. Or they invest in consumers, but there's no supply. So we have to think of the whole value chain. And as an example, oil palm, which gets a very bad reputation, as you know, but was a huge success story because Malaysia and Indonesia governments invested in supporting the crop right through to production and export. And if you can think of Vietnamese crops that the government, you know, there's a big Vietnamese diaspora, people live abroad who are Vietnamese origin. And of course, there's much more interest in exotic fruits. People go on holiday and they eat dragon fruit, or they eat, you know, logan, or they eat rambutan, or they eat these different tropical fruits, which they now can buy in their supermarkets in the UK. But is there a Vietnamese brand rather than dragon fruit? Can we get a Vietnamese brand that is people's first choice of dragon fruit? So if we can get a support along the chain, then growers have a market, local and of course export, to be able to say the government is supporting us to get these foods and fruits into the market. And because people now are interested in diverse, healthy foods, all sorts of opportunities now for value addition, product development, making foods which you can identify with your positive brand. Vietnamese food already has a very positive image because it's healthy and it's tasty and people like it. But how can we make that into an international, like Thailand? Thailand calls itself the kitchen of the world, which is, of course, a very good self-promotion. But Thailand is not the only country that can, you know, export its food. Vietnam can do at least as much as Thailand if the government can invest in Vietnamese products that people identify as quality, as nutritious, as healthy, as diverse. And I think that's one area which I think the government could support. The other, I think, is if you can invest in new technologies, they should also not just be technologies, they should be linked to where is the gap? What's the problem with the technology we already have? Is it processing? Is it transport? Is it storage? Is it cold chain? So you really need to look at a whole value chain approach, like a blockchain, where you can trace the whole value chain and invest in technologies that are blocking the chain. And I think that would be very interesting to show an analysis that the whole market could work if we shifted one part of that storage or cold chain or transport would get this food to market before it, because it's perishable and it wouldn't survive if we couldn't actually provide a cold chain support. So these are some of the ideas I think the government might want to think about.
Okay, so the question from Lena is, do you know, or maybe yourself or your team have any research on the future crops in Vietnam, especially in the Mekong Delta area? So do you know any research or yourself?
We haven't worked in, no, but what I can suggest is, I mentioned our database, crop base. It has a tool called Select Crop. And Select Crop provides a map, geographical map of crop suitability for any region in the world. So what we could do is produce a map of the most suitable crops across Vietnam. We've done this for Italy, we've done this for the UK, we've done it even in China. What would be the most suitable crops across Vietnam? We could do that exercise with a partner and then give you a list of crops that would be best suited for your own environment, and then decide which ones we should focus on. Before we grow them, let's find out which are the most likely crops that would be suitable for Vietnamese conditions. And we could do that exercise with a Vietnamese partner, certainly.
Okay. So do you have any proposal that to collaborate with you to do that from Vietnam? Not yet, right? Maybe, yeah.
We haven't done it in Vietnam. We could do it.
Okay, and another part of the question from Lena is the byproducts from agriculture, like the waste. Yeah. Do you have any example, like how we use, like the circular economy, those kind of things, like we reuse or reproduce, yeah, from the waste of agriculture? And if you have the example in Southeast Asia or in Vietnam, is much better.
We've not done very much with crop waste, but we've made bioenergy. We've looked at crops for bioenergy, and we have tested hemp. Hemp is a very potentially useful crop that you could grow in Vietnam for multiple purposes. But hemp, we tested and looked at potential in Malaysia. The climate won't be so different, and we could show what the potential for hemp would be in Vietnam and what it could be used for. Biomaterials, for energy. Of course, it's a food source as well. So it'd be interesting to investigate hemp, especially where you have this variable moisture levels. It would be a very good crop, I think, in some of the areas which are too wet for mainstream crops. So that would be an example. We haven't looked at waste from major crops or even minor crops as part of our program. That's something which we haven't yet done.
Okay. Another question from Lena is, do you provide the service from your crop-based website or from your center that you can consult to the customer, like to that land, like what kind of plant that you should grow, what kind of crop that you should grow, etc. Maybe in the future, if in Vietnam you have the map and like the list of the plant that can grow on that map from that land, do you provide also the service?
Yeah. No, we don't have enough staff at the moment to do that. What we would do is, if we could get funding, then of course we could do that with a partner who could say, we have some money to be able to look at the map of Vietnam. We have some partners which in Vietnam we could actually employ to start doing this exercise. Then we could provide the database and instructions on how they can use it, because the database is accessible, but it needs somebody to show you what the different different characteristics of it are. And we could do a training exercise for Vietnamese staff on using crop-based. I think that would be a very useful exercise if there was some help to do that. Yeah.
I think because the time already, yeah, we're already late. So maybe the last question. So I will pick the question in English, or maybe no, a question from a farmer.
Okay.
And he asked that, so the world agriculture already very developed to feed more people, but why now the food causing more disease? And human from the one that who looking for food now become to the one that who can making food very like systemically, and we can like change the nature, modify the nature, control the nature, and why the climate change, or not why, but whether the climate change will like beat people up, like the kind of thing. Like we used to control like everything. We like the God, like we can control everything. So why climate change can beat it up? Yeah, and why so many disease happen?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a nutritionist and I can't change the climate, but I can tell you the climate change is a reality. We can't pretend, it's just a variation. We now have such a long trend, and the tropics in general are very vulnerable because that's where most of the variations occur. And of course, Vietnam, as I mentioned, you have the long coast and you have, a very vulnerable region for changes both to rainfall, drought and rainfall, and high rainfall, and your coastline. But let's talk about disease. One of the biggest issues of our diet is non-communicable diseases. So when your farmer friend says, well, why are people getting more disease? So we see hypertension, we see diabetes, type 2 diabetes, we see, as I mentioned before, micronutrient deficiencies. All of these are non-communicable diet-related diseases from having too narrow a diet and depending on too few crops in our food system. Now, of course, rice, I know, is very popular and Vietnamese are very attached to rice, but there needs to be other ingredients in the diet beyond rice so that you can balance the carbohydrate with nutrition and protein and micronutrients in the diet. And that's where I think opportunities occur. So diseases are caused by, many cases, the diet we eat is killing us because we're eating too narrow and monotonous a diet. So it isn't just that those ingredients, there's nothing wrong with those ingredients, but if they are the only ingredients we eat every day, then our bodies are going to be short of other ingredients. So this is where I think alternative crops can become part of that diversification of diets. And just as an example, just not an example, a point I wanted to make really for something I didn't mention in the talk is when we say diets, we don't mean constructed diets. We can also look at our traditional diets. What did we used to eat? And we can ask past generations, older folk, parents, grandparents, can we rediscover some of the foods? And I don't know in Vietnam because I don't know the country, but are you losing some of your local culture because you're eating fast foods and northern diets? Can we look at those forgotten foods as part of your cultural history and build that into how you can actually diversify diets so that we can celebrate Vietnamese cuisines as part of your dietary experience and be able to build that in so that young children learn about traditional recipes and we could measure their nutritional content, we could help make them easier to process, but provide foods which lots of people now could use from our historical, cultural, generational background that we could now begin to rediscover as part of our food of the future.
Okay, and the second question from that one is why the climate change can beat us up. Why we can control everything, then why are we afraid of that?
Well, climate change is at a big system level, so planetary movements, ocean movement, temperature rises are something which I make the point because agriculture is the biggest cause of climate change and carbon emissions now, and is the biggest victim. So farming, not individual farmers, but all of our agricultural system now causes more than 40% of carbon emissions. And of course, farming and agriculture suffer from the consequences of climate change. So we cannot resolve the problem of climate change without transforming the food and agricultural systems, because they're contributing to it. And that's where we have to reduce our fossil fuel demand, we have to reduce our processing, we have to reduce our transport chains. And again, we have to try looking at crops that we can grow locally to reduce the cause that agriculture has on climate change. So I'm sorry, I can't stop it, but I think we can see a strategy for how we can reduce carbon emissions to actually make it less impact on us in the future.
Sorry, there's one question, maybe the last question, okay? Okay.
Sure.
Last question. Okay,
Yeah.
it's come from a student. And
Oh,
his
great.
name is Kwon, and he's the biotechnology student. And his question is your perspective, your idea, your opinion on the aquaponic agriculture and smart farming in the agriculture industry, and the potential of using those kind of techniques, and how we can optimize the price to produce those kind of agriculture products from smart farming and from aquaponic.
Yeah, I mean, we touched on it when I was talking about urban agriculture and the fact that people now live in cities. We need to look at different technologies in urban than in rural systems. Aquaponics is one. We can look at that, but we can also start looking at ingredients in aquaponics that are not the mainstream crops. So again, we talked about the waste that we can use, frass, the material that's left over that can become a fertilizer from fish waste. So all of these things we can build into circular systems, but our contribution, crops of the future, would be which are these other crops we can bring in that don't mean we have to just use the same crops for aquaculture and aquaponics and aeroponics and hydroponics, all these technologies. We don't have to use the same old crops. Here's an opportunity to bring new crops in to these different diverse systems. The problem is we don't have research that shows us the ideal combinations. And I think this is where your agricultural research centers, universities should start looking and even teaching about these alternative types of agriculture, because they're not really taught in universities. I don't know in your case, but in most cases, universities are still teaching the traditional crops in the traditional monoculture on farms. But really, we should be looking at these alternative systems to be able to show how powerful they can be as part of the future agricultural systems of the world. Because most people live in cities. We can't ignore cities as sources of agriculture and food.